In 2020, Sunoo walked into a survival show, and every single other applicant voted for him. 2 hours later, those same people sent him away. Most trainees would have taken that as an answer and given up. Sunoo didn't, and that persistence is why he's in ENHYPEN today. Later during the unit test, he was sick. He knew what it cost him in the ground if he quit, so he went out anyway. Standing in front of the producers with his body already failing him, he had one shot to prove he belonged in a place that had already decided twice that he didn't. No one else forced him to prevail and perform. The others were ready to step in if something like this occurred. So then, why in the world did he push through it if both the system and his body were telling him to stop? If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about ENHYPEN just like this, consider subscribing. At the beginning of the survival show, Sunoo performed Crown with Jake and Youngbin and was accepted into Island with 20 votes. However, he was immediately pushed out of it. There were 16 people there, but only 12 could stay. To make it even worse, Sunoo was one of the people who had to decide who was kicked out of Island. All 16 of them had to vote for each other. They just met Sunoo, and yet 10 of the 16 people voted him out. Everyone had just accepted him, but only 2 hours later, they were pushing him out. He walked to the ground with his head hanging low. He said he felt upset over the result, but honestly, who wouldn't be in this situation? The ground was one practice room and a dining area. He'd just gotten a taste of the advanced Island facility, with its several practice studios, rest areas, pantry, bedrooms, and so many other vanities. The ground was literally just a space to train and wait. While the Islanders next door were preparing the show's original song to perform for the judge-like producers, Sunoo was simply rehearsing to record a video of himself. Every day, for 7 days, he was required to report how well he'd learned the choreography and vocals if he wanted a chance at returning to the luxuries of Island. These videos went straight to the producers. He had zero assurance he'd ever make it back, and yet, he did it anyway. The only option Sunoo had at this point was to train as hard as humanly possible, maybe even further than that. Sunoo had heard people tell him he wasn't good enough before, back when he'd barely started training. His mom kept reminding him of why he was doing it every time it got difficult, that this was what he loved, and that he shouldn't give up. So he didn't. Unfortunately, Island's performance fell incredibly short of what the producers were looking for. 6 people had to go. When the producers reviewed the grounders, they saw how great Sunoo was with his expressions and chose to bring him back to the island. However, as he walked back, he cried. He felt sorry, guilty, for leaving the other grounders behind. When he re-entered the island though, he was quickly reminded of why he was pushing himself so hard. When he saw his nameplate, he began jumping from excitement, but then he was sent back to the ground. The first island mission Sunoo participated in required him and the other islanders to perform a cover of BTS's Fire. After 6 days of grueling preparation, he performed. The producers scored everyone individually, but their fates were still in the hands of the islanders. And just like last time, the others voted Sunoo out. Even though the producers could see Sunoo's potential, the other islanders felt like he was a weak point in the team. It didn't matter that Sunoo had clawed his way back into the island, and so he walked back to the ground, feeling even more upset than the last time. Months later, members of 17 would watch him perform one of their songs and single him out as the most natural person on that stage. But right now, 8 of his fellow trainees had just voted him back to the ground, despite the judges ranking him the 5th best. Sunoo was now back in the ground for the 2nd time. He'd had surgery on his lung the year before Island started, which had left him physically weaker than most of the other trainees. On top of that, he was sick. Whether it was a result of inadequate rest or just something spreading throughout Island, we don't know for sure. But when the producers announced a direct battle between the Islanders and the Grounders, he saw a real shot at leaving an impression and proving everyone else wrong, showing that even though his body might be weak at the moment, his ambition certainly wasn't. Through part 1, Sunoo had mostly taken supporting roles. He wasn't the one fighting for center or pushing for more lines, but when the battle mission against Island needed 2 vocal representatives from the ground side, Sunoo put himself forward and got the spot. He was sick, tired, and had been sent back to the ground twice. Yet instead of waiting to see how things played out, letting the other grounders fill in for him, he raised his hand. He chose to stand in front of the producers one more time, with his body working against him, and perform. Sunoo understood this could be the last chance he had at escaping the ground. The battle mission was the last one the producers had a say in. Everything else would be up to a global vote. He and Daniel, another trainee initially in Island, performed Save Me. It generally went over pretty well. The producers said the song suited Sunoo's voice, with Zico praising his vocal tone specifically. There was something about the way he sang that genuinely felt real. It was like the emotions he was singing about in the song were something he specifically was connecting to. But Island won the battle. Sunoo scored 74 points, just 8 short of winning. Unfortunately, Island won the dance battle as well, meaning none of the grounders would be moving up to the island. Even with all the effort he put in, it still wasn't enough to get him back into the island, because effort alone isn't enough for him to win his place. No one there cared about someone else's effort. Not the Islanders, not the grounders, and certainly not the producers. What matters more than pure effort is action, and Sunoo understood that very well. It's why he chose to perform, to fight, when he was sick. When Sunoo was moved to the ground for the very first time, he had 7 days if he wanted to make it back as soon as possible. On top of that, the grounders didn't get to stay at the studio the whole time. They were only allowed 8 to 12 hours at the studio per day. I imagine they were allowed to practice from wherever they were staying, but it absolutely wasn't as easy as rehearsing in front of the mirror. While other grounders rested and practiced later, Sunoo didn't. Even if his body was falling apart, he understood he needed to keep going. A 15-minute break versus being 15 minutes better goes a long way, especially when your literal dream depends on the action you take now. It's because of Sunoo's drive for action that he chose to perform during that battle mission. He could have sat out and rested, but that'd mean risking time on camera, time in front of the global viewers. It'd mean the producers couldn't see how powerfully driven he is and how skillful he truly is. Just taking action isn't going to be enough though. Sometimes you take action and fail. But what was important for Sunoo was that he learned because of it. Sunoo believed that if he didn't push himself through this and make it to debut, then everything he'd done before would be wasted. I was sick, but I couldn't think of anything else other than getting my job done. So I did it. You can't quit, can you? I thought, if I'm going to do this, I might as well try harder. Sunoo was left with one final way back into Island, and it was almost entirely outside of his control. Global votes. His fate was entirely in the hands of people on the outside now. This is the moment that would determine whether his repeated action was worth it or not. Sunoo was reasonably full of nerves as he waited to hear his placement. He stood there, staring off into the distance, lost in thought with himself, and then his name was called. Sunoo immediately broke out into tears. He placed first with the global audience, earning a whopping 2,648,265 votes. The producers took note of how popular he was as well. However, there'd eventually come a point when Sunoo would stand in front of the producers and nearly lose his chance at being a member of ENHYPEN. But right now, he could barely even imagine himself making it that far. Following his successful ranking, he walked back into the island for the 3rd time. Sunghoon reminds him he did good as the other islanders wrap around him. Sunoo felt happy. However, he understood he was only halfway through Island. He was immediately reminded that of the remaining 12 islanders, only 7 can debut, and he needed to be one of them. During the break between part 1 and part 2, Sunoo's leader pulled him aside. He told Sunoo that he was always with the other trainees, always socializing, and that he'd almost never seen him practice vocals on his own. Sunoo listened and didn't try to defend himself at all. He learned a while back that holding on to what already happened doesn't change it, so he tries to accept the feedback for a better future and thinks, let's do better next time.
솔직히 말하면 이제 리더님께서 말씀해주신 이야기들은 다 거의 팩트이기 때문에 솔직히 뭐 반박을 한다거나 그런 생각은 전혀 들지 않았다.
When he went back, he knew exactly what kind of action he needed to be taking. The first producer evaluation would require Sunoo and the other 11 to split into groups of 3 and perform a cover of a BTS song. Taki, a younger trainee, won the right to be the first to choose either his teammates or his performance song. Unsurprisingly, Taki wanted to be in a team of the best applicants. He picked Heesung, Sunghoon, and Sunoo. Even if Sunoo wasn't always the Islanders' first, he was growing into that position now. They were recognizing how powerfully he could perform and how valuable having Sunoo as a teammate is. What's so interesting though is how Sunoo won over their respect. Sunoo didn't need to beg them for respect. Rather, he just put in the necessary work and physically showed them all he was capable of. Had he simply trained like the others and never pushed himself to be at the center, they likely wouldn't have cared as much about whatever efforts he'd been putting in. Taki chose Sunoo, and the four of them began rehearsing to perform Fake Love. Following their preparations, they performed directly in front of Bang Si-hyuk and other producers. Sunoo earned 77 points, above average in comparison to the complete 12, but towards the bottom of his own unit. He'd gotten good, but it wasn't the top yet. The producers were surprised to see just how far he'd already come. When he first entered Island, he'd only been a trainee for 10 months. Huge difference in comparison to the 3 years some of the other applicants had already trained for. The fact that he was still in it at this point is a huge testament to how driven he is to debut. However, earning 77 points wasn't enough to feel safe yet. There were still 3 major missions to get through. But before they moved on to the next one, they participated in a mini-mission, this time with a few members of 17 as the judges. The now 11 Islanders split into 2 teams, with Sunoo's team performing Pretty You. However, when Sunoo performed for 17, they singled him out. Before Pretty You began, Hoshi let them know they'd be watching their facial expressions, and Sunoo did amazing with them. His expressions had always come naturally. He grew up watching music shows and absorbing every performance, and he's always been someone who feels things visibly. When a friend cries, his heart sinks too. 17 saw exactly that, with his expressive nature translating into his performance perfectly on a bubblier song like Pretty You.
오늘 되게 영광이었고 저를 되게 좋게 봐주신 것 같아서 정말 감사드리고 베네핏을 받았다는 게 되게 기분이 좋았던 것.
As soon as the mini-mission concluded, 17 left. Sunoo needed to keep pushing through Island. However, he now had an advantage going into the next round. Ever since he first entered the survival show, he's wanted to perform a later song. So when the songs for the next mission were introduced, he immediately knew which one he wanted. Chamber 5, or Dream of Dreams, would not only allow Sunoo to show off the expressive side of himself that 17 praised, but it was also just a fun song all around. It incorporated props like pillows and blankets, and gave the performer time to just loosen up for once. Unsurprisingly, Sunoo chose to perform Dream of Dreams. As part of his advantage, he carefully decided who else would fit in with the song and who was already skillful. Before, Sunoo relied on being liked and selected by the others. Now, he's the one deciding thanks to his earlier actions. Sunoo, accompanied by Heesung, Jungwon, Jake, and Sunghoon, who originally was a part of Team Flameon but was switched over after Taki's elimination, went on to perform in front of the producers just like before. This mission was basically a direct battle between bubbly styles and intense styles. Sunoo served as the team's leader and tried to help the other applicants with the bubbly song, especially Heesung and Sunghoon, who initially struggled with the loose song, but eventually figured it out thanks to Sunoo's help. However, while the Islanders trained and performed as a team, this mission's results were entirely individualized. Sunoo ranked 3rd, the highest of anyone in Team Chamber 5. Can't say I'm too surprised that he captured the concept best. He was consistently ranking either first with the global votes or ranking high with the producers. but then he ranked 8th. He'd just been ranked 1st in the last global vote. September 18th, 2020, Island's finale was live streamed. Going into the series finale, it was practically a given Sunoo would win the worldwide votes again. However, that wasn't the case. Sunoo fell all the way to 8th. Whether that was a result of voters believing he'd be able to make it in anyways, even if they voted for someone else, or the result of his biggest fans not being available to vote, we don't know for sure. What we do know is that if ENHYPEN's members were entirely up to the fan results, Sunoo would have failed to debut. Except he's a part of ENHYPEN. The producers seemingly planned for this kind of outcome, because they ensured one member would still be decided by the producers, rather than the global viewers. So when it came down to 3 applicants, K, Daniel, and Sunoo, they had to consider who would not only best fit ENHYPEN, but also who they couldn't stand leaving out of ENHYPEN. As the producers discussed, Sunoo was overwhelmed with stress. He repeatedly blinked, likely fighting off tears. If the viewers seemingly abandoned him, would the producers abandon him as well? But then Sunoo's name was announced. He passed Island, even after all the ups and downs he faced. We don't know why exactly they chose Sunoo, but we do know they deliberately went against the viewers. K, who actually placed 1st in the last concept mission, was ranked 7th. However, they went with Sunoo. By looking at everything that went down in Island, we can absolutely theorize about the reasoning. He'd only trained for 10 months, yet he was consistently putting in the work and physically taking action even when he was sick. He was incredibly expressive in a way other members lacked. He was even able to teach them to better embody their expressions. On top of all of that, he was consistently a favorite of the viewers. Truthfully, it'd be a little silly to let Sunoo go after how much he'd proven himself. However, debuting that way made Sunoo feel like a fraud. 10 days after the Island finale, Sunoo sat down and filmed a video diary. At this point, he was 17, about to accomplish the dream he gave so much up for. Yet he was exhausted in a way he couldn't explain. The producers had chosen him over the global audience. He felt lost because of it, like he owed something extra now, like he wasn't allowed to be tired when the opportunity was this big. Sunoo felt like he had to prove himself all over again because the global viewers seemingly lost interest when it mattered most. He knew that wasn't a healthy way to think about it, but that certainly didn't stop him from overthinking his situation.
정신적으로 자꾸 사로잡아가지고 그런 게 좀 멘탈적으로도 그렇고 육체도 조금 아직 정리가 안 되는 것 같아, 확실히.
And so he tried handling it in the way he always had. He talked to himself in the video diary, told his future self to stay strong, to think about the fans, and to remember everything he'd gone through to get here. The thing about Sunoo is that taking action had basically always worked before. Every time Island pushed him down, he found something to do about it and did it. So when debut came and something felt off, his first instinct was the same one it had always been: work harder and never stop moving. In 2021, Sunoo kept practicing the Go Big or Go Home choreography while the other members rested, because he was worried about affecting the group if he didn't know it well enough. Even after the success of Border Carnival, he was scared of letting down his team. However, that feeling he'd been carrying since the Island finale wasn't something he could out-practice. And yet, for a while, he just kept trying anyway. He tried pushing himself and keeping everything to himself, believing he'd figure it out if he just took the right action. However, 4 years later, he understood that would never work. During the Walk the Line tour finale, Sunoo stood in front of 10,000 engines and said he'd already been crying before he came on stage, that the members probably didn't even know, that he'd spent a long time believing he was strong enough to handle everything by himself, a self-T type, someone who overcame things alone, and that lately, the thought, "Am I the problem?" had been following him around privately until it got to be too much.
살짝 좀 나는 이제 많이 컸고 23살이고
이제 같은 어른이니까 어쨌든 조금 제 나름대로는 되게 혼자 이런 거 그냥 이겨내야 된다 라고
Taking action alone had always been his answer. It just wasn't the only one. Nearly 5 years later, Jake applauded him for being brave enough to be open about his struggles.
근데 이렇게 많은 분들 앞에서 울고 하는 것도 강한 거예요, 선우 씨. 감정을 보여주는 게 강한 거예요.
ENHYPEN's survival show was tough. The lesson he learned because of it was incomplete, but all of it was necessary for Sunoo to become his most open self. If you want to see how Sunghoon gave up a successful career as a figure skater to chase his dream as an idol, you can click the video on screen. And if these thoughtful breakdowns help you love ENHYPEN more, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.